So we are back for another episode. This is episode 49.
Oh my gosh, we're so close to 50.
We hit 50 tomorrow, or not tomorrow. Next week we hit 50.
Week.
Tomorrow we're doing daily podcast now.
Oh my gosh.
Next week we hit 50. So today we're going to start kind of a series dealing with medicine and illness and things like that.
Yeah, in America.
In America. Well,
although, yeah, you've announced to me that you're going back to Egypt. So
well, I mean, this is the problem. I mean, we've said this before. Don't ever ask an historian to explain something, because you'll find yourself 2,000 years in the past, and they're like, to understand it fully, you need to look back at blah, blah, blah.
I do that all the time with my students. I'm like, we're going to actually head back a couple hundred years to really understand what's going on here. And I think that they've kind of just come to expect it now. They're just like, okay. But it's true.
Yesterday was the first day of fall quarter for us at UC. And I was explaining explaining the collapse of manorialism and during the Black Death.
On the first day of class?
Yes.
You monster.
And I started going backwards. And I caught myself when I was tempted to go back to Rome and Roman land reforms. And I was like, oh man, it's the first day of class. I probably shouldn't be talking about this, but
you have a 10-week quarter though too, so you really don't have any time for syllabus day.
Right? Yeah, no, I do part of the day. There's a little bit of syllabus discussion, but and it's a Tuesday, Thursday class. We have two holidays. We have Thanksgiving and Veterans Day that kill our two of our Thursday meetings. So
you had no choice but to talk about this on the first day.
Well, because I want to give them all the context they need to understand what the whole point was. By the end of the class, I wanted them to understand what it was like to be a Florentine, not the cookie, a citizen of Florence at the end of the 15th century, and what that meant and what it looked like. I also kind of wanted them to start to be able to understand why it's different if you're kind of an urbanite in London versus living in rural England versus living in northern Germany. Because I'm really tying geography.
Well, that discussion's relevant to what we're covering today, really thinking about geography, urban versus rural, when we're talking about the development of early medicine. So, yeah, you can always get into that kind of conversation.
One of their readings this quarter is actually William Harvey, who talks about the heart. And he's an English guy who actually gets his medical degree in Padua in Italy. And I think a lot of people forget that Italy for a long time is the epicenter of Western medicine. It is the place. The University of Bologna, the University of Padua. This is where people go to learn medicine.
Well, it's the epicenter of everything for a really long time, right around that era, right? Art, culture, medicine. Yeah. Yeah, well, see, you can always go back a couple hundred years.
Yes. Well, it should be an interesting trip. Well, let's go ahead and start.
Let's do it.
Welcome to An Incomplete History.
I'm Hillary.
And I'm Jeff.
And we're your hosts for this weekly history podcast.
So, before we get into the history of medicine, I have to ask you, what's the weather like?
I'm so happy to report that we have a reprieve. It's been lovely. I actually walked outside this morning to let the dogs out, 6 o'clock in the morning, and there was a slight chill in the air, which I've never felt here. It was slight, but it was there. It was in the 60s, which was surprising to me. So
to go from the 90s to the 60s, it's a big drop.
Right now it's 85 with a real feel of 93. So that's a
Ugh.
little toasty, but it's far better than it was a week ago, a month ago. I'm seeing the light at the end of this disgusting heat tunnel. So
So what you're saying is this morning felt like pumpkin spice weather,
I wouldn't go that far. This morning it was 67 degrees. It felt perfect.
right?
It didn't feel like I needed a pumpkin spice, but it felt like, gosh, I'd like to sit out here and enjoy this normal temperature, you know?
You like pumpkin spice lattes,
I don't know.
but you love Halloween.
I hate Halloween. Are you like, who are you talking to right now? Like,
So fall is not your favorite time of the year.
I love fall. I
That's so
love fall.
weird
I
that you
don't
love
like
fall, but you don't
Halloween.
like
No,
fall things.
no,
Like,
well, okay, I don't, the holiday of Halloween is terrible. I don't like anything ghoulish, um, despite being a historian. And yeah, I don't like that.
I think you also think the colors are hideous,
Oh,
right?
I hate the orange and the black. I think we've covered this. Now you're remembering. I don't like Halloween.
Yes.
I like the fall season though. I really do. I think it's beautiful out. Although I'm not going to get anything like that here, I miss Pennsylvania fall.
I mean, where you went to where you did your undergraduate, I would assume you would like pumpkin spice latte.
Well, and you're just making a lot of assumptions about my gender and my race and about my personal appearance. Like
But you had
I
Uggs.
oh, I still have Uggs.
You had leggings.
I still have leggings. I think I'm
Did you have
wearing
a
some
North
right
Face
now.
jacket?
I absolutely have a North Face jacket.
Okay. Like,
But I don't drink coffee, so
oh, well, there you go. What if you could get pumpkin spice, but it's not coffee? It was like, it's something else.
are you asking if I like pumpkin flavored things? Yes.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
do.
Okay. So it's the coffee, probably.
It's the coffee. Yeah.
All right. Um,
So so yeah, I'm basic in every other way. Thank you for pointing that out. It's just the coffee that I don't. I was telling my students the other day, I was like, yeah, I watch true crime shows and podcasts like the basic white person that I am. I guess I have to own it at a certain point.
um, our summer's been so weird here, and
Well,
now
it's
that
been
it's
really hot
fall,
right now, isn't it?
well, it got super hot right at the end. Like our, it was at least where I live in San Diego. It's been unseasonably cool more than it's been unseasonably warm this summer. But now summer's over and it's heated up. Although today it was weird and cool this morning. I don't know. The climate's so messed up right now. Who knows? Like,
You guys are gearing up for your fire season
well,
too.
supposedly,
Mm-hmm.
hopefully we've escaped it so far in San Diego for the most part. Hopefully we
Yeah,
continue.
I hope so.
But anyway, the history of medicine. So you joked in our kind of
I love
pre-show
this topic.
discussion, like
I mean, I
that.
have a whole class on it this semester.
Do you start with the Egyptians?
I didn't start with the Egyptians. No,
Do you start with the Egyptians?
no, I didn't start with the Egyptians.
Oh, well, I'm going to start with the Egyptians.
Go for it.
So, almost 5,000 years ago, the Egyptians are cataloging diseases. And I, I think that's a hallmark right there of the beginnings of something we could call the professionalization of medicine. When you start like cataloging stuff and try to organize it, there's something going on there. 200 diseases. Now, some of them are real diseases and some of them actually weren't diseases at all in a modern context. But, this Mediterranean kind of discussion about the body culminates kind of in Hippocrates. It's where
That I did talk about Hippocrates.
right.
So I did
So,
go back pretty far, I guess.
right. So around the 5th century BCE, Hippocrates is around and he kind of is credited with the scientific study of medicine, although we have to kind of put a little asterisk next to that. He also starts prescribing something that's very similar to aspirin to his
Mm.
patients. And,
Well, he comes up with the idea of the humors, right?
mhm,
Yeah.
well, yes and no. like, so the humors, so there are four humors. Um, and there are kind of Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Galen are the three kind of people who contribute to the idea of the humors. And the humors dominate European understanding of the body for centuries. And there are four humors. So there's black bile, there's phlegm, there's yellow bile, and there's blood. And these three kind of philosophers, scientists, Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Galen, come up with the idea that when something is going wrong in your body, when you're suffering an illness or something, it is your humors are out of balance, and you have to get those back in balance. And the way you do that is you purge to get things rid of things like phlegm or yellow bile, or you get bled to release like blood, which is one of the four humors. And as Aristotle loves to do, these humors are tied to the elements. Um, so black bile is earth, phlegm is water, yellow bile is fire, and blood is air. Um, and they're also tied to kind of certain qualities like old age, childhood, parts of the body, the spleen, the brain, the gallbladder, the heart, as well as planets. Because remember, astrology is all wrapped up in this as well. And I mean, it really dominates through the 15th century. It
I think it
dominates.
goes all the way into the 18th century.
Oh, yeah. I think
Yeah.
there are people who are practicing medicine in the American colonies who are definitely still referring back to these things.
That's like Benjamin Rush going around bleeding everybody in the
Hmm.
1793 yellow fever epidemic, I think is evidence of that carryover of this idea from the 4th century BC, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there was a great sketch they used to run on Saturday Night Live. It was called Theodoric, Barber of York. And barbers, kind of in the medieval period, were also basically medical practitioners.
Yes, yes, that is
And you would go
interesting.
get your hair cut. They would put some leeches on you. They might do a little
Isn't
bloodletting.
that so wild?
Um, and it really does dominate the way people um, view the human body. And it's so dominant that um, it kind of prevents changes for a long time from
It
happening in the
prevents any
medical,
new inquiry,
because they think
right?
they've solved it, right? They think they're like,
Yeah.
oh, but here's the answer. Um, and there's another thing that's going on as well. As the Christian church kind of gets dominant and gains power across most of Europe, um, there's a real prohibition against things that you need to develop an understanding of the human body, including like dissection, vivisection,
Hmm.
right? I mean, there's a real ban on that. And in 1489, there's kind of a break with this because Leonardo da Vinci dissects a corpse. He famously dissects a corpse. And a couple of years, well, 50 years later, Vesalius publishes kind of this atlas of the human body, of human anatomy, De Fabrica Corporis Humani, which is a real watershed moment because now we suddenly have, a map of the human body, and we understand that there are things we don't know what they do, right? So once you've kind of mapped out what the organs are of the body, aspiring doctors are like, well, we don't know what that does. We don't know what that does. We don't know how this works. So it opens up this whole field of inquiry. Um, at the same time, we're getting other scientific advances, including the development of Janssen invents the microscope. So now we have, by the end of the 16th century, we've got all the necessary parts for a real revolution in the understanding of the human body.
Well, I think the other thing with the understanding of disease, which doesn't come along with the understanding of the human body, is also a theory that's related back to Hippocrates, and that's the miasmic germ theory, the miasmic
Mhm.
theory of disease, right? This idea pervades medicine all the way into the late 19th century when it's replaced by germ theory. But the idea that there's bad air, and
Mhm.
bad air is what causes people to get sick. So you have this idea that when the body gets sick, it has these different humors, and you have to bloodlet, or you have to, you know, drain bodily fluids in multiple different ways. And I'll let you go ahead and take that as you want. Um, but then the idea though is like the way that you get sick is because of miasma, like a putrid air. And that idea of illness carries all the way past the Civil War
Mhm.
before
So,
they figure out germs or the cause or pathogens, right?
well, I mean, so you've got the understanding of the body and kind of illnesses springing from kind of internal conflict within the body. And then you've got this, I mean, even though the miasmic approach is incorrect, it does have a kernel of truth to it, though, because
Mm-hmm.
they are recognizing there's some external thing that's causing this to happen.
And they're living in putrid filth.
Oh yeah, I mean
I
it's.
mean,
I mean we
the
have this discussion all the time. God, it must have stank.
well, and they said it did. I mean,
Well,
they
I don't know. There's
said,
somebody just did a. There was a peer-reviewed article about medieval hygiene that recently came out, and they're making assertions that didn't. It wasn't really as filthy as we thought. I wasn't really convinced by the
okay,
article. I
I'm not
was,
convinced at all because I've not read the article. I'm sorry, I shouldn't
yeah.
talk about it. But if they're saying it's not as stinky as we say it is, everything I've read from that period that literally talks about dumping human waste
Hmm.
in the streets, there's absolutely no way that it didn't smell.
Right.
And there's absolutely no way that that wasn't getting people sick because, in any study I've done, like prison studies and stuff, cholera runs rampant in these
Hmm.
institutions because there's no plumbing.
Hmm.
And they do understand that those diseases are coming from waste, but they think it's coming from like the air, like the stinky air of it, rather than
Hmm.
in other ways. But they do recognize, yeah, like we got to clean this place up because it's stinky, and if we get all this stink out, then maybe we'll get the disease out. But I mean, they're kind of onto something, but not fully.
Right. I mean, I think that it's interesting that they do recognize it's something external. They just can't quite figure out what that is. But the whole thing about being exposed to the air can cause illness that persists to today. Oh,
Right.
better put a jacket on or you catch a cold. No, you won't.
Right. Well,
That's not how colds
here,
function.
you may not have gotten this lecture as a little boy, but you can't, if you're a little girl, you can't go out with wet hair.
Oh, yeah, because you'll
Yeah.
get a
You
cold
catch a cold.
or pneumonia.
Yeah, you'll get pneumonia. You'll come down with pneumonia. You go out with wet
It's just
hair.
like that's not how that works.
No, it's
I mean,
not
you
at
might
all.
get hypothermia,
You might be uncomfortable.
right, but you are not actually going to develop like a cold. I mean, it's interesting how that persists. That kind of miasmic notion persists even today. Um, but you get this. So you get an atlas of the body, then you get a microscope, and then when I kind of teach a little bit of this, and I teach it a little bit this quarter as I talk about the Renaissance. William Harvey in 1628 publishes this study of the heart and of blood, and it's amazing. It is the first kind of sustained scientific study of the heart and what it does and how it functions. Now, Harvey used animal corpses to kind of
Hmm.
do this, which in and of itself is revolutionary if you think about it, because these scientists are increasingly, they know it's hard for them to justify dissecting human corpses, so they go to animal corpses. But if you're dissecting an animal corpse and looking at the heart to understand how the human heart works, there is a recognition you're making about what humans are.
That's true. And that you're trying to experiment in some way that shows that there's maybe a crossover between systems.
Hmm.
Yeah, that
I
is
mean,
interesting.
so right. So Harvey makes this publication, but what Harvey does that I think pulls him back a little bit to the medieval period is he looks at the heart and the way the heart functions and compares it to the way the Earth is at the center. Like he compares it to a geocentric model and like the sun and all of this stuff.
Then it just takes
Wait a
a
minute.
real left
Harvey
turn.
Harvey may have actually had a heliocentric view. Harvey did. Harvey actually adhered to the heliocentric model, but he compares the way it's organized to the way the solar system's organized
Hmm.
because he wants to see some kind of perfection there. He,
Right. Well, so that's an interesting segue into the way that I kind of start the class is talking about the confluence of religion and medicine
mm-hmm,
during this time period. There is a major attempt on behalf of a lot of budding physicians or scientists, etc. That there's a huge crossover with their religious belief, and there is an attempt to create like a well there's a crossover between God and man and human design and the planetary design, and all of it all makes sense because it's all created by God. And then illness is also created by God, and you end up with this, I don't know, like I said, kind of like a confluence of religion and medicine. um and Protestantism, this idea that, well, illness and death are just to be borne humbly and submissively as God's will and judgment. And the very first healing art that was often implored was prayer. Prayers, potions, blessings.
mm-hmm.
Oftentimes a doctor at your side was praying just as much as he was doing anything else.
Yeah,
There wasn't a conflict between science, medicine, and religion for a long time.
I mean, I think that changes for some people by the 1350s, though. So I think the Black Death comes along and wipes out 25 to 50% of people in the world. Um,
Bad time.
Bad time. And I think some people's reaction is, wow, this isn't working. Like the church was assured us we would be protected by from bad things like this, and it didn't work. Now, some
Mm,
people double down. This is funny. I basically talked about this yesterday in class. Like some people double down and say, look, we're not religious enough. This is punishment.
right.
We have done bad things. We are being punished. Let's go burn some women and say they're witches.
Well, and
Maybe
that's the
that'll,
form it takes in the colonies, I
yeah.
would argue. In early American medicine, it takes that super doubled down conservative approach to say, and Cotton Mather's kind of at the helm of this.
Hmm.
It's like, we're not praying enough. We're not pious enough.
But then at the same time, you have some people who are leaving and saying, look, this isn't working. The church is lying to us or they're misrepresenting what's going on. I mean, God should have protected us from this.
Hmm.
Um,
So you think it kind of creates a crisis of faith?
I think it does. I think that's how I always teach the Black Death is that it is a moment of there's a crisis of faith. I think the trajectory of the Black Death to things like humanism as well as the Reformation, it's a pretty short line.
Hmm.
I can understand if you've kind of been exposed to these, and the Black Death comes back again and again and again. It's not like it's just there for a few years and then disappears. Like it's a recurrent thing for
There's
a
still
long time.
plague that exists.
There is still plague that exists.
Yeah.
Um, so, we get to the American colonies, and I know it's kind of a jump, but the American colonies are a very interesting kind of case study about understanding health. Would you agree with that?
I agree a lot because people were dying in droves when they were coming to the American colonies for the first time. And the survival rate of making that trip, making it through winter, Just surviving in 17th and 18th century colonial America is a feat. And you have this rampant spread of disease, some that are new and some that are not. Um, they have difficulty dealing with the climate, difficulty dealing with um, they have problems with native people, etc. And then there's a complete more than decimation of the population of indigenous people due to the bringing over of European diseases. And
Mhm.
it's a complete mess, I think is the best way to put it, medically speaking. The colonies and the meeting of these two cultures, people, is a complete and utter disaster, medically speaking.
So you get these epidemics that pillage Indian populations,
Yeah, and I
um,
said decimate, but that indicates that only about 10% of the population died, but it's more like 90% of the population.
annihilates, right?
Yes.
Annihilates is more. But I mean, you also get periodic illnesses that run through the colonies themselves. Smallpox is this kind of recurrent villain, right? I mean, it comes
Mm-hmm.
back again and again. And so you get these settlers, these colonists from England, and they bring over medical knowledge from England with them. And for smallpox, I was reading cures that the
Uh-huh.
colonists thought worked.
Oh, yeah.
Um, One of my favorite is that you needed to burn a pot of toads to ash
Yes, I saw that
and then
one.
eat the remains.
Yes, that works every
Oh,
time.
oh.
I think it's like if you can survive burning a toad and then eating it, you're made of pretty strong stuff. But so there's the thing, like there's this again, like this overlap of religion, medicine, magic, all this kind of stuff. I think that overlaps in a really interesting way in the 17th century, where it's like it's kind of impossible to ignore how there was religion plus superstition plus some advancements in medical knowledge, and they all kind of just were flowing at the same time. And you would get things where it's like, oh yeah, that actually works and that makes sense, like early smallpox inoculation, advancements in that. And then it's happening right alongside burn and eat a toad. There there's a lot of, and it's interesting in the context of what's going on right now with our current pandemic. It's like there's a lot of ideas out there, and like some of them are right and some of them are really wrong, and it's hard to get everybody on board with one idea. You might have told somebody, hey, there's this whole inoculation thing going on where you infect yourself with smallpox and then you can get over it quicker, and people are like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm just going to eat the burned toad. And I
Mhm.
can't help but think, like, I'm just going to take the horse dewormer. I
I,
mean, there's a lot of similarity, and I'm not trying to be funny. I mean, I just think that there's a similarity, and then there's also a continuity in the way that people address or deal with disease or a scary moment like this.
well, I think people want something familiar. And if it's radically different from what they're used to, it's a much harder sell for them.
Hmm.
So you get these remedies. And I think that's the thing is I think ivermectin in one way is from a long line of these remedies. So one of the things the colonists start to do is they bring this knowledge from England with them, but they are in a new world, right? They are in a place with different things, different foods and animals and plants available to them. They're also on trade routes. And I love how remedies start to incorporate rum much more
We've talked
regularly
about this,
in the
right?
colonies
Yeah.
because there's this
Yeah.
like wide availability of rum. And then if you go inland a little bit, it's going to be whiskey and it's everywhere, right?
Hmm.
And so you get to start, this article, and I think you probably read the same one from Harvard, where
Oh
this
yeah.
historian's like arguing you can see the shift because suddenly you get recipes that call for lemon, lime, sugar, rum. That indicates a strong connection to the Caribbean.
Sounds just like a cocktail to me.
It sounds like a cocktail. It actually, I mean, here's the recipe. It's a solution of lemon or lime juice,
Mm-hmm.
loaf sugar, cordial water, which is a liquor,
Mm-hmm.
and then salt. I wonder how much salt, because I bet it was just a little bit of salt.
Just a little tiny
So
bit.
it was probably a tasty little. It was almost like a daiquiri or something. Um,
Sounds good to me.
like, but it was to treat fevers and stomach and throat ailments.
You wonder how much rum was in it if it was just like knocking people out.
Well, I mean, we've talked about this. See our
Right.
episode
We have
about
talked about the
how drunk people are in
inebriation.
the colonies. I think it was probably a lot. I mean, that's the thing is, what's your go-to cold medicine even today?
NyQuil.
NyQuil. Why?
Because it knocks me out.
Because it knocks you out and you
I
sleep through
don't
the
have to.
illness.
I do.
Like, I don't know if it really does anything to treat the cold other than just knocking you out.
No, I do. And whenever I start getting sick, I say, well, time to bust out the sauce.
Oh
Like, I'll
yeah, like
just chug that stuff and
yeah,
just go to bed.
I mean, it's it's one way to deal with kind of temporary ailments.
Yeah, it is. No,
Just
it's true.
inebriate yourself so much that you just sleep through it.
Yeah.
Um, but we get to, this. So the American colonists start to develop their own medical practices.
And
And
these are often informed by currently existing indigenous practices and medical knowledge brought from African societies. So
Mhm,
you have this overlap of these three different cultures for the very first time interacting with one another in this, for the Europeans, this new place, for the Africans in this new place. And they start to come up with new ways of treating things. They're kind of sharing knowledge, medical knowledge back and forth. They're watching, okay, you eat this root or this plant or you drink this tea. And there becomes this idea that medicine is kind of dependent on geography of where you are, that there are different ailments in different regions and there's different treatments for different regions. And that makes a little bit of sense.
yeah, well, I mean, generally hot, humid climates are viewed as deleterious to your health.
Hmm.
For white people, right?
Right.
I mean, so
Very
Thomas
delicate.
Jefferson famously, like Thomas Jefferson, bag of bad and good ideas all mixed up, famously, like, believed, or maybe not famously, I don't know if people know about this. Thomas Jefferson believed that if a white person moved to a hot, humid climate, over time they would eventually darken and become black,
Right.
which is interesting. I mean, the idea that he sees
I mean, I think you get a tan.
race is not immutable.
Hmm.
Um, but race is a big issue here as well. And I think it's an uncomfortable discussion that a lot of people shy away from. I know when I took kind of colonial history classes, it wasn't discussed. When I took kind of 19th century stuff, nobody really wanted to talk about this, but I think it's an interesting question. Enslaved people are means of production for those who own them.
Hmm.
But they are also humans, which means they have health requirements. So, what does medical professionalization look like, or what does medicine look like in places where slavery's dominant, like the American South and the Caribbean? I mean, do we start to get a divergence from New England versus the southern part of the colonies as slavery really shifts to the South?
Well, I think it depends on the era. So
Hmm.
I would make the argument that after Congress bans the importation of slaves from Africa, which goes into effect in 1808, there becomes a really intense need to keep the existing slave population healthy.
Hmm.
And in the starkest and most vile of terms, to keep their property
Right.
in working order. And that's it, I hate that discussion. I hate that language, but like it's the truth of the matter is like there isn't some benevolence of like, oh well, we want to take care of people. There's this idea that they want to protect their economic interests
It's expensive to replace them,
It's
and it's
expensive, and
impractical.
it's not possible anymore because there's no
Right.
longer an importation. So the population of existing slaves in the United States has to naturally reproduce itself, and in order to do that, they have to keep them healthy. And so I think that medical advancements start to take place, more experimentation starts to take place in order to figure out, how do we keep people alive?
Hmm.
That conversation wasn't necessarily taking place in the colonial era, and it certainly wasn't taking place for the enslaved, because that's another thing, is like death rates for everybody in colonial America were insanely high. The infant mortality rate was really high, the maternal mortality rate was really high, and most people weren't making it past their 30s. I mean, there were just a lot of people dying left and right all the time. They were completely surrounded by death. I think, if you look at like epithets on graves from the colonial era, there's one that I have that's like the poem that would always appear on there. Lament me not as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so must you be. All flesh is mortal, you may see. Everybody was just dying all the time. And there was like this acceptance of it, like, oh, yeah, people getting sick, people dying. And I think that the attitude toward that changes eventually once, the importation of slaves has to stop. And, I mean, I think that there's the huge connection there. But I would say in the early colonial era, there's a huge acceptance of death and its providence. And again, I think it's that relationship to religion that I was saying earlier that kind of dictates the way that they approach disease or approach death or approach treatments, because there's this idea that, well, everyone's just kind of dying, so there isn't, I don't know, I don't see huge shifts in the way that they try to preserve life necessarily until a little bit later.
Right, but well, so we know that prior to the kind of ban of importation, uh, um, so we have slave doctors, and slave doctors are medical practitioners who are slaves themselves.
What does it mean to be a medical practitioner
Well,
at
so
that time?
they were recognized as having expertise in their community,
Okay.
and they were going. So I would argue with midwives are the same thing, and we can
Yes.
kind of move to a discussion of midwives after this because I think it's another fascinating moment. But I would say first of all, you have many of the people who were captured in Africa and then forcibly brought over to become enslaved people. Many of them didn't travel empty handed. Many of them took things with them. So we get West African plants that are brought over.
Mm-hmm.
It had medicinal
Foods.
value.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to get people within these communities who have knowledge of how to use these plants, how to treat certain conditions. I mean, their body of knowledge was as complex and rich as that had developed in Europe, right? That you use certain remedies and plants and concoctions to treat certain illnesses. And
And they're allowed to do it early on.
well, because you know, it was a way to kind of let them do, sure, because it doesn't seem to hurt anything. But pretty early on, there starts to be a fear that if you're kind of an expert about these plants, you may also know how to poison
Well, and
people with
that's
it.
why a lot of people who were recognized in their communities, women and enslaved people who were recognized within their communities, they start to get ousted and there become
Mhm.
bans where enslaved people are no longer allowed to practice medicine. And this is in the early Republic era.
1748, the Virginia House of Burgesses
That's,
forbids,
yeah, that's even earlier. Yeah.
yeah, any Negro or other slave to administer, quote, any medicine whatsoever under pain of death without benefit of clergy. So
Right.
now they're saying you have to have a member of the clergy there before this can happen.
Mm-hmm.
And you could only be a member of the clergy if you were white.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be white oversight on this. However, exceptions were made in that 1748 law for slaves treating other slaves.
But even that, so that's when what I was referring to in the early Republic era is even treatment of other slaves is banned.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think we should talk about smallpox a little bit because the treatment for smallpox ends up coming from African medical knowledge.
Yep. Sure does.
So how did they treat smallpox during the Boston epidemic in the 1723?
1723, the Boston. Do you have those notes handy?
I do.
You join. I have my midwife notes up already.
Oh, I'm
Let's go into
sorry.
midwifery.
Um,
Um,
but in
uh,
the Boston epidemic, um, I think is an important thing to discuss just quickly. Um, so I would like to point out, though, first of all, that there's smallpox epidemics all the time, and it's not just you know to one year or one era. But so the Boston smallpox outbreak is 1721. That's when they experienced the largest outbreak of smallpox. And you had over half of the population in Boston infected with smallpox. The population was a little over 10,000, and close to 6,000 people were infected. So you had this huge outbreak, and this is during the era of Cotton Mather, and there were he knew somebody who was enslaved. I think it was his slave, who came out and said, hey, I know how we treat smallpox where I'm from. We do this procedure where you infect somebody who's not infected purposefully. You go, and we've talked about this clip before, right, on the John Adams series of how early inoculation worked. And it's not vaccination, it's inoculation, which is different. And so what they would do is they would take somebody who was infected with smallpox, they would take one of the pustules and they would scrape it and then cut a hole in your arm and then purposefully infect you with smallpox, and you would get sick, but not as sick as you would if you'd had like a natural exposure outbreak of it. And then you would recover, and then you would end up with a lifelong immunity to it.
well, it was because it would go into your blood instead of your lungs.
Right. And by the time the infection oozes out of your body, it's not as big of a viral load, is what I discovered. Because I had to look that up because I'm just like, I don't understand how this works.
See, there's a great visual depiction of this in the miniseries John Adams on HBO.
Yeah. Which I
It's
think
kind of
we've
gruesome.
mentioned before. It's good though. I
It's
show it
good.
in class. It's just a couple minutes long. You can look it up on YouTube, look up John Adams smallpox, and it's like a 3-minute clip from the show. And it's really good. What I want to point out though is think of what we were talking about originally about there's this idea that there's these humors in the body, and that if there's something wrong with you, you need to drain your body. You need to drain your body of blood, of pus, of urine, of feces, of semen, whatever, right? Like they're all the things that you need to be draining your body of. So that was the idea. That was how medicine worked. And so you
Mhm.
come along with this other idea of like, actually, you should introduce a disease into your body. That freaked people out.
It was
That was
controversial.
completely contradictory to everything they thought they knew about medicine, and the fact that it was coming from somebody who was enslaved. There was little interest in people wanting to become inoculated.
Well, I mean, so here's the thing, and I want to segue a little bit to midwives because I love talking about midwives. So here's the thing: I think enslaved people who practice medicine and women who practice what we call midwifery, and there was some overlap there. So you actually end up with enslaved midwives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of knowledge there, and one thing that starts to happen at the end of the 18th and across the 19th century is there's an exclusion of those two groups.
Yes, in
And this
medicine.
is, and I would argue the African American community in the United States has a very complicated history with medical professionals.
Yes.
And I would say it starts with this initial exclusion of kind of their own doctors.
Yeah, not being able to practice medicine or
Right.
heal
Being
their own
banned from doing
communities.
that. Um, and then the later transition that happens in the 19th century, where now you have doctors that are serving slave owners
Mm-hmm.
by treating
Yeah, and it's not
enslaved.
treating the human. It's not treating the
Right.
individual.
It's treating them as property.
Right. And
Right.
like, so anytime they were examined or there was a diagnosis or anything, they wouldn't even know their diagnosis. The medical report would automatically be given over to the owner of the person. And there's a huge exclusion from treating your own community and being treated. I mean, having any sort of open communication or knowledge or understanding of what it is that ailed you, there was no respect to offer that. So yeah, there's this really fraught relationship between medical professionals in the Black community that stems all the way back to the colonial and early republic era.
So, midwives. Um,
Midwives.
One of my favorite books I read in undergraduate and then graduate school. I read it undergrad and then I came back and read it again in graduate school. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. Um, who Hillary and I are both academically related to now.
Don't know
It's
about that.
true.
I don't know about that.
It's true.
That's what they would say in the academic
That's
community.
what Mark would say.
It's like our
Um,
academic grandmother.
right. So Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, she's an historian. She's at Harvard University. She writes this book called Midwifes Tale, and it's a micro history. She takes this diary that Martha Ballard, this woman in New England, had kept for 27 years. And if you just kind of look at the diary and don't pay much attention, it just doesn't seem to talk about anything that's really important.
When historians had known about it for a very long time and kind of just like, boring,
So,
looked it over. Yeah.
so Ballard goes back and starts to look at
Ulrich
this,
goes back.
and she finds amazing points of detail. Like this woman who lived kind of in rural New England. She lived near Hallowell, Maine, in the Kennebec River, not really close to the center of anything going on. She actually finds out how virtually everything important that happens between 1785 and 1812 is somehow reflected in Ballard's writings. But we also get this super complicated yet very richly detailed view of A, what it's like to be a woman in this period, and B, what it's like to be a midwife and what that entailed and all the people she treated. So over 27 years, she delivers 816 deliveries successfully. And this is at a time where childbirth is still a
Mm-hmm.
risky endeavor. Um, and we just get these, her husband's kind of a loser.
He's not a loser.
He's kind of a
You think
well,
so?
okay. So her husband, her husband had odd jobs.
Yeah.
And one of his jobs at one point is to be a tax collector.
Yeah. And
And the
then
way tax collecting
yeah.
worked at the time was if you were like given the list of taxes you need to raise, and if you didn't come back with that much money, you were on the hook for that money.
You got arrested. Yeah. And so
And
he,
so
he
he ends
does
up in
end up.
jail.
Yeah.
Um, okay, what about this? A couple of Ballard's children are ingrates.
They're awful. Her children are awful to her, and they take major advantage of her in her older age
In her
when
older
her
age.
husband is in jail.
Right.
To me, what I like about it is like she's the successful one in the family.
But and
She's
she's
the
well
successful
respected in
one,
the
very
community.
well respected.
People look to her for advice
Not
on
yeah,
things.
and not just childbirth, right? She
It's
attends people who are sick in the community all the time.
She's a doctor,
She's a
right? I mean,
doctor, yeah.
she is a doctor. A childbirth is the most obvious thing she engages in, but that's not the only thing she
Mhm.
engages in.
Mhm.
I really would recommend, if you want to read something that's pretty short, easy to read, but really wonderful, read Midwifes Tale by Laura Fletcher
Okay,
Ulrich.
I
It's just,
disagree with you on the easy to read. I found
oh, you think it's,
it's not. I love the book and I assign parts of it for my undergrads, but I have a hard time getting through it, and I'm just being honest.
hmm. Now, don't
I mean,
confuse
as
this,
far as history texts go, I'll say that it's one of the better ones, but I think historians are awful writers. So,
some of them.
most of them. Most history books I've read are really not good. And
Um,
that's sad, but it's true.
but then what starts to happen is Ballard, by the end of her life, well, actually, most of her life, she's increasingly competing with a group of men
Hmm.
who have a new way to deal with healthcare.
And they suck at it. They don't know what they're doing.
They kill people.
There's one anecdote that I love from the book, and it's in her diary, and she's talking about how she's attending a woman who's in labor, and the male doctor comes, busting in and gives the woman opium in
Hmm.
the middle of her labor and like puts her to sleep. And he's like, well, this will stop the pain. It's like, no, she's in labor. She needs to be in pain and pushing the baby out.
Yeah.
And then he leaves and he's like, okay, you're feeling better because you're basically passed out because I just drugged you up. And she stays behind and waits for her to come out of this drug induced stupor and finally is able to deliver the baby safely. But
Hmm.
doctors, male doctors, had no idea what to do with the women's bodies. They had no idea what to do with childbirth, child rearing, postpartum, nothing. And they start just waltzing in and saying, well, we're in charge here now. And they don't know what they're doing.
Well, and it becomes pretty rapidly in the 19th century, it becomes unseemly for a male doctor treating a woman to even look at her
Right.
genitals while he
Right.
treats her.
Right.
So they put this sheet over, and he has to kind of play touchy feely
Yeah.
to figure out what's going on.
And they don't know what they're touching and feeling.
And they don't know that. And it's, I mean, you kind of wonder, maybe veterinarians would have been better doctors for women than these
Right. Because they've at
medical.
least, yeah.
They had some experience, some real practical experience. But that's not, I'm not suggesting women are animals.
Yeah,
I'm
I
just
didn't
saying
like that.
the
But yeah, I understand what you're saying.
the veterinarians weren't kind of constrained by these ideas of modesty and what was proper and
Right,
what
right.
wasn't.
And they were bringing lots of animals into the world and understood sort of how it worked. Whereas these male physicians, and I'm putting little air quotes up right now,
Well, they're
didn't know their ass from their elbow.
their training was abysmal.
Well, they didn't have really any
They
training.
didn't really have anybody could, like, I could just put a hat on and move to a couple of villages up the coast
Right,
and call myself a doctor now.
right, right.
And we get it periodically. We get these doctors with the quotes, who get chased out of these towns because
Yeah,
they're kind of revealed to be frauds.
quacks. They're quacks.
Um, but there's a real reticence to embrace medical professionalization initially, but pretty quickly, unlike places like England where midwifery is still a thing, for white Americans in the early republic, midwives become increasingly marginalized.
Hmm.
And they actually, to have a midwife in the United States by, I'd say, mid 19th century, is to mark yourself as non white or of a very low class.
Hmm. Which is so ironic because they're the ones who are probably getting the best care.
Yeah.
They thought it was like in vogue or something to bring a man into the equation, but he didn't know what he was doing.
So let's finish up with Benjamin Rush, because he's kind of the
Okay.
poster child for the American doctor.
Yeah, well, he is, and I think he's the only physician who has like a statue dedicated to him, right? And there's a medical school named after him, and all this.
I mean, Jonas Salk has a statue, doesn't he?
Maybe he does now. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little about old Ben.
Well, he is most famous for his treatment of yellow fever in Philadelphia in 1793 epidemic of yellow fever. And he is, this kind of brilliant physician who is trained. I mean, he ends up going to Princeton. Well, it was called the College of New Jersey at the time, but he was the
Mhm.
youngest person to ever graduate from Princeton. He graduated at 14 years old. He decides on a career of
Doogie Howser.
medicine. He is kind of, yeah. He decides on a career of medicine. He apprentices uh, with famous doctors across the Atlantic. So he goes to University of Edinburgh. He gets his medical degree, and it's rumored that his medical education was paid for by Benjamin Franklin, who was grooming Rush for a position in at the College of Philadelphia. He's very well connected. Charles Wilson Peale paints him, and if you have a portrait by Charles Wilson Peale, you're a big deal. He had a long career in medicine. He taught thousands of medical students, but he was teaching based off this idea that the best way to treat anybody who was sick was to bleed them. And he
Or
had this theory of disease or sickness, and he said that all diseases are born of one fever, and what you really need to do is to bloodlet in order to cure people.
he also, one of his treatments, and I don't remember what illness it was for, he prescribed people going in a rowboat out in the middle of a lake or a pond
And just sitting there?
and just sitting there.
Yeah. Well, okay, so he's also known as the father of American psychiatry. And he does actually have some innovative treatments for psychiatric illnesses that are far different than what was going on at the time. He actually thought, okay, this disease is something with the brain, and it can be cured, and we shouldn't be locking these people away, and we shouldn't be putting them on display in what they called idiot cages in the middle of the town square. He actually did have some innovative practice when it came to mental health treatment. But when it came to the physical health of treating people, he was bleeding them to death. I mean, to the point where he has this theory. I'm bringing up called depletion therapy. So I'm going to read a
Hmm.
quote from him. He says, I preferred frequent and small to large bleedings in the beginning of September. And he's talking about at the height of the epidemic. But toward the height and close of the epidemic, I saw no inconvenience from the loss of a pint and even 20 ounces of blood at a time. I drew from many persons 70 and 80 ounces in 5 days. He estimated that the average person contained 25 pounds of blood and recommended that 80% of it be removed.
Oh my
Whoa.
God. Wow.
Yikes.
I
And
mean,
so
so
he
that's
kills a lot of people during the yellow fever epidemic. He kills them. It's not yellow fever. He bleeds them to death to the point where there are people writing in the local papers and stuff that it stunk so badly outside of his house, and that there was like piles of blood outside of his house in the
mm.
yard, and that there were constantly flies swarming Benjamin Rush's front yard because of the amount of blood he was dumping out from people on a daily basis. How's that for a good detail?
So I mean, it just points to, even in the 18th century, there's this moment where you've got these physicians who are doing things that appear more modern to us, but they're still kind of wedded to these older ideas. They just can't get rid of them.
Yeah.
But that changes, and that's what we're going to talk about next time, right? We're going to pick up with the probably the most pivotal event in medicine in the United States, at least, is the Civil War.
Oh, okay, we're going to go all the way to the Civil War.
Well,
Okay.
that's kind of our first big. I mean, we're going to talk about other things, but that's kind of our first. I mean,
Okay.
war changes the way the United States deals with illness and the way medicine works
Yes.
through the Civil War to the Spanish American War to the Great War to World War II. It really changes the way medicine is dealt with.
hmm I'd like
Um,
to do an episode, if we may, on obstetrics and gynecology and the development of that field in relation to slavery. I mean, I think that that's a
yeah,
really important thing to talk about in the 19th century
yeah.
as
I mean,
well.
that's like I said. I think it's the uncomfortable conversation that needs to be had. Is like, what are the connections between the shift from enslaved people kind of being left to their own devices for their own medical care versus now the slave owner is going to kind of mandate medical care for the person they choose, but it's not for the benefit of the person, it's for the benefit of the slave owner.
Exactly.
um, and and there are medical advances that come about because of it.
hmm
And um,
And
but
that's
again,
how the modern field of gynecology is founded,
but
is
I
through experimentation on Black women.
and I think that is why the medical profession has such a complicated relationship with the African American community in this country.
Yes.
Just one of them. I mean, we have
One
many
of the reasons.
examples that we can
Yeah.
talk about,
hmm
but I mean, it's just one of them. But yeah, it's um, yeah, it was a fun conversation about bloodletting. We talked about bloodletting a lot.
Well, they were doing it a lot. That's how I think that's how George Washington actually died, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they were just bleeding him and bleeding him and bleeding him, and it. I don't know why they thought that was a good. I can't even imagine why they thought that was a good idea,
I don't know.
but
Yeah.
that's what they were doing. And so in Benjamin Rush's case, so many of his patients end up dying who may have, if they had just left them alone, they may have been
Hmm.
able to beat the odds because, you know, of course, yellow fever has a high death rate, but being bled to death while you're sick also has an even higher death rate. So he's able to rehab his, his reputation's definitely rehabbed a little bit later. And again, we've got colleges of medicine named after him. He's got statues and stuff. But like in his time period, he was a very controversial figure, and the local newspapers just lambasted him. Like this guy's a freaking murderer. Alexander Hamilton hated him.
Hmm.
But anyway, that's enough for today, I say.
Yeah. Well, it's so come back next week. Listen to part two. Um, should be fun. I mean, entertaining. Maybe not fun. Maybe fun's not the correct
It's
word. I
not
don't know.
fun. It's not fun.
Um, but next time, I mean, we start to get vaccines developed. Actual
Yes.
vaccines
Yes,
are going to be
because
part of the story next time.
yeah, there's an actual
Um,
smallpox vaccine that's developed.
right.
So
Germ theory, all of that starts to get developed, which is more, it's a more recognizable modern medicine. Yeah. Well, until next time, I'm Jeff.
and I'm Hillary. Thanks for joining.